In this lesson, we're going to look at the two different options that we have for interior snapping. So I'll enable point snapping using the snap radial menu, and I'll open the snap options using the Ctrl+Shift+J key. Interior snapping can only be enabled when depth snap is enabled. So with depth snap on, I'll enable interior snapping, and we see that this first view-based option is the one which is selected by default. I've already got this low-res sphere object in my scene, and I'll switch to wireframe mode so that we can actually see the inside of it. And I'm also going to add a null object from the Create Shelf tab. A null object just represents a point in space. We see it has some viewport geometry, but this is just a viewport guide. The null doesn't actually render at render time. Nulls are mainly used for parenting, rigging, and animating, but I'm just choosing to use a null in this instance because its minimal viewport icon should help us to see how this interior snapping works. Interior snapping allows us to snap an object to the midpoint between a specified geometry component and an intersection point on the opposite side of the mesh. View-based snapping is easiest to understand if we use it in an orthographic view. So I'll tap Space+B to switch to the 4-view layout, and I'll select this null in this front view and snap it to this point here on the sphere. If we now look at the resulting position of the null in the perspective view, we can see that when I snap the null to this point at the front of the sphere here, Houdini snapped the null to the midpoint between this front point and the point directly behind it on the back of the sphere. If I take the null in the front view again and snap it to this point here, we can see in the perspective view that Houdini has snapped the null at the midpoint between this front point that I clicked on and the point that's directly behind that on the back of the sphere. So the way that view-based interior snapping works is that it takes the point that we snap to, and then it draws an imaginary line from that point along the viewing angle to where it intersects a surface on the opposite side. It then positions the target object at the midpoint along that line. Let's take a look at how this works if we snap to a point in the perspective view. I'll hover the cursor over the perspective view and tap Space+B to maximize that view, and I'll turn on the point display and also the point numbers. Each point on an individual piece of geometry has a unique number, and enabling this point display option just allows us to see a visual representation of those point numbers in the viewport. I'll rotate my view so that I'm looking at this point number 23, and let's just adjust this so that the viewing angle will intersect on the other side of the mesh, somewhere between point 41 and 53. Now I'll snap the null to point 23, and I'll rotate the viewport so that we can see the nulls being positioned on the midpoint between point 23 and the intersection point between points 41 and 53. In fact, we could just quickly visualize this. I'll add a line to the scene from the Create Shelf tab, and I'll give this 3 points so that we have one on the midpoint of the line. I'll tap the apostrophe key to detach the handle, snap the handle to that midpoint, reattach the handle, and then I'll snap the handle of the line to the null. I'll tap the semicolon key to enter the align state, and I'll set the y-axis to be the primary axis, and then hold down Ctrl and Shift and click on point number 23 to rotate the line to point at that point. So now we've got a visual representation of how this view-based interior snapping works. Houdini takes that component that we snapped to, then it looks along the viewing angle to the point of intersection on the opposite side, and then it positions the selected object right in the center point of that line. I'll just delete that line, and now let's take a look at normal-based interior snapping. So with normal-based interior snapping enabled, if I snap the null to one of these points on the sphere, we see that the null ends up close to the center of the sphere. And whichever of these points I snap to, the null ends up in a similar position near the center of the sphere. If I enable the point normal display option, we can see the normal direction of each of these point components. And the way that normal-based interior snapping works is that it draws an imaginary line along the normal direction of the component that you snap to the point of intersection on the opposite side of the geometry, and then it places the selected object at the midpoint along that line. Let's have a quick look at this normal-based interior snapping with a different object. So I'll select a torus from the Create Shelf tab, and I'll also add another null. I'll just turn off these geometry visualizers to make this a bit easier to see. And now if I snap the null to one of these points on the torus, we see that it ends up in the interior of that cross section of the torus and not in the center of the torus. If we follow the normal direction of the point component that I clicked on back into the mesh, we see that it's first going to intersect on this inside wall just here. And so it makes sense that the null will get placed in the very center of this cross section here. We've been looking at this interior snapping using point snapping so far, but it also works in exactly the same way with primitive snapping and the other geometry snapping modes available under the multi-snap options. So if I quickly change to primitive snapping using the snap radial menu, and then go to the primitive tab snapping options and enable interior snapping and set it to normal based, now when I snap to a primitive on the torus, we see we're getting the same interior snapping, where Houdini's looking along the normal direction of that primitive until it first intersects the surface on the opposite side, and then placing the null at the midpoint along that line. So that's how we use interior snapping. Below that in this properties menu, we have snap consolidate, which is something that we only really use at the geometry level when we're creating and editing the actual components of geometry. So we're not going to look at that one right now. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at this last orient on snap property.